Chapter 2 of My Flirtations by Ella Hepworth Dixon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 2. Perhaps it was by way of contrast to the superior person that I appreciated Tony Lambert so much, for a time. He was the most naive individual I have ever known. Indeed, his naivete quite disarmed me. And in a breezy, boyish way he was diverting. To be sure, he did not expect me to read Schopenhauer, of whose existence I imagine he was but dimly aware, nor did he ask me to spend afternoons at the National Gallery. Kempton Park and the Gaiety Theatre were more to his taste, and while this sportive affair lasted, the house had a rollicking, youthful atmosphere which was the result of something more subtle than Tony's ringing laugh, and Tony's skirmishing fox terriers, who invariably accompanied their master in his many visits. We neither of us took each other seriously, and that added a certain charm to the thing. Everybody at home liked Tony except, I think, Christina, who said she couldn't understand his slang, and that he made a draught in the drawing-room, he was so boisterous and restless. The family saw a good deal of him in those days, for he was being painted in parade dress, and he used to stay to lunch so as to be able to pose again in the afternoon. I remember the first time he came in with father, pink with mortification at being seen in his uniform in the daytime out of barracks. Whence comes, I wonder, the love of mufti so deeply implanted in the breast of the British officer? Tony, fortunately, learnt to forget his early sense of discomfiture, and spent many merry half-hours in our little study when he had done sitting, singing soldiers' songs with a fearful and wonderful accompaniment of his own invention, while the dogs chased each other, barking joyously, over the sofas and chairs. How he used to light up the dim little twilight room with his scarlet bravery and his irrepressible spirits! Mr. Anthony Lambert was the eldest son of Norfolk people. One day or other he would come into possession of a fine old house, some excellent shooting, and $3,000 a year, an income by no means large enough to keep up the Towers. Therefore it was an understood thing, especially by Lady Marian, his mamma, that Tony, when he married, was to marry money. In the meantime Tony was to be painted, first to adorn the next exhibition at Burlington House, and afterwards the collection of family portraits at the Towers. So that in this way the boy, in spite of Lady Marian's precautions, came directly under the influence of a most undesirable young person, to wit, myself. Tony was a lieutenant in a line regiment, and I fear his high spirits made him have occasional differences of opinion with his colonel. In appearance he was distinctly good to look at. He had a clean pink skin, twinkling blue eyes, and hair so flaxen that it was almost silver. His shoulders were broad and square, he had a delightful laugh, and he was just 23. And without being in the least conceited, Tony was thoroughly pleased with himself, his regiment, and his belongings. He had, in a supreme degree, the magnetism which comes of perfect health, good spirits, and complete self-satisfaction. What an infectious thing is happiness, and what a golden age is 23! With what vigor did Tony play lawn tennis, how excited he got over races and cricket matches, how hot he became when he danced, what portentous suppers he could eat! The very sound of his voice in the hall, a voice with raised inflections, for the ends of Tony's sentences always finished joyously, roused one up on the foggiest and dreariest of days. To go for a walk in the park or along Piccadilly with Tony Lambert was a whole education in itself in the ways of young men. His joy was so manifest when a pretty face, a showy figure, or even a well-cut gown appeared in sight. He had the omnivorous glance which takes in every detail, and which is the prerogative of men who spend most of their leisure in sport. Seldom will you find a writer, a lawyer, or a scientist with the faculty of observation as highly cultivated as in the most brainless individual used to the rod and the gun. Tony, by the by, was one of the young men with whom I corresponded by electric telegraph. As a matter of fact, I do not possess a scrap of his handwriting. Whether he was doubtful of his prowess in grammar and spelling, or whether it was a bit of worldly wisdom beyond his years, will remain forever a mystery, but Christina got quite tired of those agitated pulls of the bell which announced the telegraph boy, while at this period orange-colored envelopes were served up to me at every hour of the day. There was nothing he didn't offer us, from invitations to military balls, to bags of American candy. To me especially he offered a great many photographs of himself, in various degrees of military splendor, which gave my room, for the time being, quite a spirited and martial air. Of course this didn't last long, for my photograph frames and space to put them are limited, whereas my friends are many, and in the course of years one frame contains many counterfeit presentments. Christina says that if I have a heart it must be like my photograph frames. From what I could gather, Mr. Lambert was never in love with fewer than 3 ladies at a time. He was like one of the modern monster shopkeepers, a sort of universal admirer of the fairer sex. And yet one never blamed him for it, perhaps because he was so perfectly candid in his enthusiasms. As far as I could make out, the fair with whom I shared his affections at this time were his major's wife, a person with fluffy hair, an exaggerated figure, and a well-worn smile, and an individual whose acquaintance it appeared he had not yet succeeded in making, but who occupied a distinguished position in the second row of the Gaiety chorus. It was always amusing to get Tony on to the subject of his loves. The little friends that he played with seemed to have been of all ages and sizes, and his amorous difficulties appeared to have been numerous. Once already had his family offered a substantial sum to a young lady in the Camberwell Road as a substitute for Tony's hand. But that, as he acknowledged with a pink and rueful countenance, had been in his gay and giddy youth. Having now arrived at the discreet age of 23, he was resolved to mend his ways. And to begin well, he proceeded in his airy and irresponsible way to imagine that he cared about me. I wonder what Lady Marian would have said of the 3 months that followed. Tony took his long leave on January 1st, and it was at this time, being a good deal in London, that he sat for his portrait. For the next 2 months Christina and I were never sure when he would not burst into our den with his joyous laugh, and a couple of excited dogs wagging delighted tails, with some project of rushing us off somewhere or other in search of amusement. What would Lady Marian have said to all this, I wonder? And of those many accidental meetings in Bond Street, when we used to drop in at the minor exhibitions, and come out sublimely unconscious of whether we had been looking at Van Beers or Gustave Doré? Or of the pompous dances in Queen's Gate to which mother allowed me to take the boy, and where he met, I believe for the first time in his life, the youth and loveliness of South Kensington? Tony had met county girls and garrison girls and Gaiety girls, but I don't think he had ever before danced with a London middle-class damsel. Lady Marian, I verily believe, would have preferred the young person in the Camberwell Road. But our last dance was not to be in Queen's Gate. The regiment was ordered to the Curragh, and Tony was in despair. Nothing would do but we must come to the regiment's farewell ball at Mulchester, and it was there, in the long, low rooms of the officers' mess, against a background of flags and military trophies, that I saw Tony's blonde head for the last time. The pretty scene comes back to me now, the glare of scarlet coats among the flesh tones of the women, the delicate tinted tulle dresses against a bank of pink azaleas and palms, the blue uniforms of the gunners and the green of the rifles striking a somber note in the gay chord of color, the intimate sadness of those valse refrains which the band of the regiment played, and over all that acute atmosphere of mixed pain and pleasure which is associated, when one is 18, with the words, "For the last time." It was my first soldier's ball. How well I remember the whole atmosphere of that night: the Colonel, smiling, urbane, and slightly indifferent; the Colonel's wife, a lady with protruding teeth and neatly parted hair, who was said to be wealthy; the eager young faces of the junior subalterns as they surrounded some showy beauty; the heavy-jawed captain to whom I was introduced on my entry, and who deserted me at once for a buxom lady with dubious hair and many diamonds. Oh, those military ladies! How dashing, how much too dashing they were! What drawn-in waists, what liberal smiles, what suspiciously white shoulders! How pert and off-hand they seemed in public, and how confiding they looked in obscure corners down back passages, where Tony's straw-colored hair and scarlet coat were to be seen often during that night. Heaven has not been pleased to inflict on me a suspicious disposition, or I fear I should have passed but an indifferently amusing evening. For Mr. Anthony Lambert, with the gay insouciance of youth, had thoughtlessly invited some half-dozen of his loves, and his major's wife, it appeared, was inordinately jealous. Some 15 years ago this lady had been described in a local newspaper as a magnificent blonde, and she had been living up to the epithet ever since. She had all the airs of a beauty, and she seemed to regard Mr. Lambert as her especial property. At 10 o'clock I heard her reproaching him for only wanting 3 dances. At 1 o'clock she deliberately fetched him out of a balcony where he was saying good bye to a pretty little girl with red hair. I don't wonder that Tony looked harassed. The smile of his major's wife was terrifying. Poor boy! I at least had never worried or reproached him, and I think he was proportionately grateful at the last. It was a black night and pouring rain, I remember, when we finally drove away, but I could see that Tony's blue eyes looked unspeakable things as we whispered a final hurried good-bye at the carriage door. One morning, a few months later, we read in the paper that a marriage had been arranged, and would take place immediately, between Mr. Anthony Lambert of the Blankshire Regiment, eldest son of Mr. and Lady Marian Lambert of the Towers, Sleepington, Norfolk, and Catherine, eldest daughter of Patrick O'Flaherty, Esquire, of Dublin. He had been taken seriously by a garrison beauty a dozen years older than himself. Although they have already 3 children, I hear that Lady Marian refuses to see her enterprising Irish daughter-in-law, and now the regiment is in India. Poor Tony! He was born, it would appear, to be the sport of the less amiable members of our sex. His major's wife is, of course, with the regiment, and people say that Mrs. Anthony Lambert is primitively jealous. A ridiculous song that he used to strum always occurs to me when I think of him, for the refrain, "Woman, lovely woman," epitomizes the tragi-comedy of his blameless little life. End of chapter 2.